Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we got to see the creative processes that the Beatles went through with Yellow Submarine, and how Paul and John asked their entourage to help them with the words they needed to finish songs. And then John got a little bit jealous when he wasn't a part of Paul's song and the creative process at one point. Then we had the Beatles were going on tours to Germany and Japan, and there was a huge difference in these trips. The Beatles decided not to party like they had before. Instead, they would play games to pass the time. There was trouble in Japan, but in this episode, we will see the Beatles face trouble that they had never encountered before. On the morning of July 3rd, the Beatles and their entourage left for the Philippines from Hong Kong. Mal later recalled, "It was here for the first time in my life I was to experience real fear. Things were a bit off when they got there." After attending their usual post-arrival press conference, John, Paul, George, and Ringo were hustled out a rear entrance and taken to the harbor, where they were put on a motor yacht. George said it was really humid. It was Mosquito City, and we were all sweating and frightened. For the first time ever in our Beatle existence, we were cut off from Neil, Mal, and Brian Epstein. There was not one of them around, and not only that, we had a whole row of cops with guns lining the deck around this cabin, and we were on the boat. Around this cabin that we were in and on the boat. We were really gloomy, very brought down by the whole thing. Then things got worse. After Brian succeeded in securing the Beatles' return to the mainland, they found themselves in the luxurious Manila hotel for the night. The Beatles didn't know, nor did their entourage, but the Beatles had received an invitation from the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos and First Lady Imelda Marcos, requesting their appearance at the Malacanang Palace at 11 the next morning. Only Brian and the Beatles never laid eyes on it. After the incident at the British Embassy in February of 1964, official requests for Beatles' presence were routinely ignored. Instead, the Beatles in Manila performed the first of two shows for some 35,000 spectators at Jose Rizal Memorial Stadium, and another audience of 50,000 later that same day. Things seemed normal enough at this point. The audience was purely and simply Beatle fans, Mal remembered, and both shows were received with the wonderful warmth they got from their fans everywhere. For the moment, the band and their entourage hadn't felt any blowback from having snubbed the First Lady, although there were some critical news reports on Filipino TV. That night, the promoter arranged for a lavish party at the hotel, with numerous prostitutes on hand to cater to the boys' needs. And at one point in the evening's festivities, Mal wrote, I opened Neil's door to his darkened room, where he was sleeping peacefully, having retired early with a headache, and pushed a young lady in to keep him company. Now, Neil didn't want to know at all, and she was to exit 5 minutes later, leaving Neil with some sort of terrible social disease. On the morning of July the 5th, Mal began to sense trouble when a pistol-packing member of the promoter staff requested autographed pictures of the Beatles. I was in the middle of explaining that I had given away most of the photographs, Mal wrote, keeping a few for the plane crew on the way home, when I was cut short by the same gentleman brandishing a gun in my face and repeating the demand. I couldn't give them to him fast enough. This was a prelude to a morning of terror. Mal felt the tension in the air when he got the truck to transport the luggage and gear to the airport. The feeling in the air was that nobody wanted to be associated with us, he wrote. On arriving at the airport, I was informed by the police on duty that I couldn't park near the airline gate, but in the normal parking areas like ordinary people. Their attitude being, "Who do you think you are?" And when the band and their entourage arrived at the airport, Mal discovered that no one would help them, save for the KLM airline attendants who processed their baggage. Everything fell apart when they began making their way to the international lounge, only to be intercepted by a dozen Filipinos. Mal wrote it was obvious that they were looking to cause trouble and quite prepared to beat the hell out of us because of the fiasco the previous evening with the First Lady. They were standing on our toes, jabbing us with elbows, generally giving us a bad time, and the last thing we could do was hit back. Up to that point, they were just a nuisance and making us feel very uncomfortable. I would give my right arm for any of those boys, but under the circumstances it was most inadvisable to retaliate in any way whatsoever. To stand there and see my beloved Beatles treated so roughly was heartbreaking to me. The chauffeur, Alf Becknell, could not contain himself any longer. He dared to strike back at the assailants, and he was viciously attacked, ending up flat on the airport floor with a pair of cracked ribs. Even though Mal was large in size, he got numerous blows, as did Ringo, who was knocked down with a swift uppercut and crawled away as the assailants kicked him. When they got to the customs, things got worse. John and George were punched and kicked, and Paul managed to avoid the brunt of the violence by sprinting ahead. Along with Alf, Brian suffered the most, sustaining a sprained ankle during the melee, and at one point, Mal realized he was bleeding from his leg. Mal never forgot the surrealness of walking across the tarmac after the violence that they had experienced back at the terminal. You could still see the attackers hurling insults and threats as the Brits made their way to the waiting KLM jet. But the fans were there too, shouting, "We love you, Beatles," and tossing bouquets of flowers at their feet. Mal wrote, "Once on board the plane, sitting in the seats and fastening seatbelts, we all gave a sigh of relief, thinking that we were on neutral territory. We were all shaking, beads of fear running down our faces. It's moments like this when the thought of home and loved ones fills your mind." And that is when immigration officials boarded the plane, demanding that Mal and Tony follow them back to the terminal. In that instant, Mal wrote, "I knew I was never going to see the friendly skies of England again. Visions of being thrown in jail and left there to rot passed through my mind, and as I walked past Brian's seat, I bent down and said to him, 'Brian, please tell Lil, Julie, and Gary that I love them.'" Back in the terminal, Mal and Tony were led even deeper into the building. "Tony and I walked as close to each other as possible," Mal said, getting some small crumble of comfort from each other's company. In the immigration office, they found themselves once again at the whimsy of the mob, being jostled, pushed, and shoved as custom officials demanded that they fill out new immigration forms. As television crews recorded their every move, the two struggled to complete the forms, their hands visibly shaking in terror. And then they were led back to the plane, and after 40 minutes away from their friends, Mal and Tony were back in their seats. The last words we heard before the doors closed were, "We love you, Beatles," Mal wrote. On the way back to England, the KLM jet made a stopover in Delhi to refuel. Led by George, the group opted to stay behind for a few days to decompress after their experience back in the South Pacific and to experience Eastern culture up close. But for once, Mal wasn't having it. "The Beatles were so relieved at getting out of Manila alive, I felt they wanted to stick together," he wrote. "But home was calling me." This time he longed to spend precious moments with new baby Julie and the rest of the family, and it overmatched his yearning to be with his beloved Beatles. Besides, he would be back on the road with the boys in a month for their third U.S. tour. In Mal's absence, the group made a crucial decision after Neil let it slip that Brian was already planning concert tours for 1967. "Nobody can hear a bloody note anyway," said John. "No more for me. I say we stop touring." On July the 8th, the rest of the group arrived back in London, where George joked to a reporter that we're going to have a couple of weeks to recuperate before we go and get beaten up by Americans. So Mal's restful stay in Liverpool was short-lived. In the days before the U.S. tour was set to begin, the American magazine Datebook republished an interview that the London Evening Standard's Maureen Cleave had conducted with John back in March. And John had said, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink." John had said, adding, "We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." After that news came out, radio stations across the American Bible Belt sponsored Beatle burnings, elevating John's remarks into an international controversy. For Mal, the whole business was much ado about nothing. "I can't read John's mind," he wrote, "but to my way of thinking, whenever we did a show on a Sunday in any city, there would be many more people in the audience to see the Beatles than there would be attending church. I know at the time religious authorities were generally complaining about the empty churches and the lack of support from their parishioners." The 1966 American tour began with the Beatles' most unusual press conference on record. On the 11th day of August, before the band's show at the Chicago's International Amphitheater, John tried to calm things down. "I wasn't saying whatever they're saying," he explained. "I'm sorry I said it, really. I never meant it to be a lousy anti-religious thing. I apologize if that will make you happy. I still don't quite know what I've done. I've tried to tell you what I did do, but if you want me to apologize, if that will make you happy, then okay, I'm sorry. This tour in America was planned for 18 shows across the North America that would conclude on August 29th in San Francisco. 16-year-old Victoria Muncie was there that day in Chicago, hoping to cover the press conference for the Teen Life magazine. Victoria was from Kansas City and had attended the Beatles' September 1964 press conference, and in the ensuing years had interviewed Jerry and the Pacemakers, Herman's Hermits, and the Dave Clark Five. During the 1965 tour, she attended the Shea Stadium concert, and with her Teen Life press pass in hand, had gained entrance to the Toronto press conference. And she was prepared to go to an early dinner with her father, Dick Muncie, a Kansas City physician. And that is when she saw Mal get into the elevator at the Astor Tower Hotel. Victoria said, so of course I jumped in after him. He said, what floor? And I said, well, I'm on 11, but I'd rather go to 27. And he's like, I'm on 27. And I'm thinking, you really think I don't know that? I told him about the press conference and how I was supposed to have been there. And he said, well, the boys are exhausted, but if you stay around until tomorrow, they should get up around 8 and you can have your interview. Then he asked where I was going, and I said I was going to meet my dad. We're going to have dinner. And he said, may I come with you? After sharing a friendly dinner with Victoria's father, who left early, Mal and Victoria returned to the hotel and went up to the 27th floor. When they got to the Beatles suite, Victoria observed that all the doors were closed, leading her to assume that the bandmates had turned in for the night. She said that Mal was very sweet, and we talked and we talked and we sort of made out. And while she was unable to meet the Beatles the next morning to do the interview, she exchanged contact information with Mal. And later that year, the letters from her new pen pal began arriving, elegantly adorned with this beautiful British handwriting. Now I wonder what Lil thought about all these young girls writing to her husband. Mal was confronted with the usual series of challenges that accompany a big-time rock and roll tour. The supporting acts included the Ronettes, the Circle, the Remains, and Bobby Hebb, who had recently had a major hit with Sonny. Mal this time had extra hands at his disposal, a professional photographer and a singer-songwriter, Ed Freeman, who was a roadie for the Remains, while Mike Owen worked for Circle. So Freeman was a novice roadie at best, helping out Mal and Mike by tuning all the acts' guitars. With the threat of violence after John's Jesus remarks, Freeman admitted, I was probably too stoned to be more normally cautious. He was in awe of Mal, who was able to grab his arms around the Beatles amps with no assistance. He would just grab them, put a hammer lock on them, and lift them up single-handedly. There was no way any normal human being could do that. Vern Miller, the 21-year-old bass player for the Remains, said that Brian Epstein was very precise. He knew what he wanted. One night he got mad at Neil because Neil set out the wrong color suits for what Brian thought the lighting of that night's stadium would require. Miller could also see the Beatles starting to become exhausted with that level of precision. I remember being on the plane, he recalled, and John had to change his pants before he got off the plane with the rest of the group. Brian wanted the Beatles to present a cohesive look, and John was grumbling, saying, why do I have to change my pants? Vern remembered that Mal was a larger-than-life character. He was jovial, and when it came to prepping and tearing down a stage, there was no question that Mal was a senior guy. Even so, he could party as hard as anyone, according to Vern. During the tour, the roadie had taken to carting around a violin case he called his sin kit. An alcoholic compliment to his dope bag, the sin kit usually held a bottle of booze. But Mal's appetite for vice didn't stop there. I remember sitting across the aisle from him on the plane, one of the flights, because we were all sharing a chartered jet, Vern said. And I remember seeing Mal with this cute little reporter on his lap, bouncing up and down. So he was a pretty uninhibited kind of guy, and apparently this reporter was a pretty uninhibited kind of young lady. During that first night in Chicago, Mal listened in horror as the Vox amps seemed to be turning on and off. He figured out the problem in 10 minutes flat. discovering that the fans in the balconies were dancing on the power cables, and that was causing the interruptions. A few nights later in Toronto, he neglected to bring the boys' stage outfits to the Maple Leaf Gardens venue, and he had left them on the plane. Commandeering a limo, Mal later wrote, he drove like hell for the airport, calling ahead on the car radio so that they would have the plane's baggage compartment open for me. We also had a police escort because of the traffic conditions. Half the time we were riding the pavement and the grass verges. Such was the status of the Beatles that the police worked wonders, getting me back to the stadium just in time to meet the Beatles as they left the dressing room to go on stage. There was a crowd control issue in Cleveland. The trouble began with Paul. With 7 numbers remaining in the Beatles set list, he wrongly introduced Day Tripper as the band's final song. And mistakenly believing that the group was about to depart the Cleveland Stadium, the crowd began pressing forward. They eventually broke through the police cordon and forced the Beatles to suspend the concert for half an hour until security could be restored. While in America, reminders of John's remarks in Date Book were always in evidence. In Washington, D.C., 5 white-hooded members of the Ku Klux Klan paraded outside the stadium in protest of the Beatles' perceived blasphemy. The next day, during the band's stay in Philadelphia, Mal found a spare moment to pen a letter to Lily. He said, "Lil, it's amazing how many people know me over here," he wrote. "I know it sounds big-headed, but nearly all the fans know me. And it's terrific how many know about Gary and say, 'How is your wife and baby daughter?' I get a big kick out of it." This tour had been less riotous than the Beatles' 1965 visit. The concert in Memphis, though, gave the entourage cause for concern. Major William B. Ingram sponsored a resolution by the city council proclaiming that the Beatles are not welcome in Memphis. "We of the commission feel it is our duty to protect Memphians against the Beatles' use of the public Coliseum to ridicule anyone's religion." The group's route to the Mid-South Coliseum was thronged with protesters holding Beatles Go Home signs, and the local Ku Klux Klan picketed the venue. Mal recalled that in the warm sunshine outside of the Coliseum, the white supremacists' white-shrouded anonymity did not strike fear in the heart, just looked daft. At the conclusion of the afternoon concert, Mal went on a rock and roll pilgrimage to Graceland. Sadly, the king was not in town, but to Mal's good fortune, Elvis's father Vernon lived on the grounds. Plucking up courage, Mal wrote, "I knocked on Vernon Presley's door, thrilled when I was invited in, and offered cookies and coffee. The 2 topics of conversation being Presley on my side and the Beatles from his families. The Beatles' afternoon show went without a problem. The band's evening performance was a little bit different. As George sang If I Needed Someone, a loud bang went off in the arena. A cherry bomb had been tossed on stage. Well, that was crazy, whoever did that." Mal later wrote, "I could see the 4 Beatles looked at each other to see if either of them was bleeding, thinking for sure somebody had been shot. Incredibly, the group went on playing without so much as missing a beat." Standing backstage, the entourage felt a sense of relief, grateful to be nearing the conclusion of their southernmost gig. But they weren't out of the woods just yet. The next town after Memphis was Cincinnati, and Mal later wrote, "And it was here that I was nearly electrocuted." So I'm going to end the video here. And in this episode, there was plenty of bad times. The Manila disaster, and then the fans turning against the Beatles in the United States after John's remarks about religion. Mal felt in Manila for the first time that his life was in danger, and all he wanted to do was to go home to his family. Then, while they were in the South region of America, there were Beatle records being burned, and threats were made, and it had everybody looking over their shoulder. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. And more importantly, I want to wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you.